Forgive me, I wasn't intending to be late today. But for traffic reasons, we weren't able to arrive on time. So sorry to keep everybody waiting. I'd first like to very much thank Professor Bindu Lakshmi for the invitation. I think it is very well taken by me, and I'm sure Abhinav feels the same way. I'm very happy to be able to speak here today. I don't know, can you hear me? Okay. I can use that. I'll use this. So I'd like to that's too loud. I'd like to thank everybody for coming here today, and the subject of the discussion, also I'm very honored to be a Tata, the subject of the discussion and the presentation, which I'm very happy to examine, is the question of spontaneity amongst working class people, as well as the question of revolutionary organization, which is absolutely essential. Over the last, actually say more than a decade, I've been working around workers' movements. I've been studying workers' movements in the United States and beyond. More increasingly over the last 8 to 10 years, my focus has shifted to the global South as social movements have dramatically expanded in this part of the world, and as the centrality of the working class has grown outside of the United States, outside of Western Europe and so forth, outside of North America and Western Europe, and as the workforces of the global South have expanded dramatically, there has, by extension, become a very great expansion as well in the level of militancy. What do we mean by militancy amongst workers? And this is a point that I'd like to develop here. And starting with militancy amongst workers anywhere, there's a degree to which workers, if we go back to the work of the writings of Karl Marx and so forth, the Communist Manifesto and many of his other works, he examines the degree to which socialization within the workplace develops, and the reasons why workers engage in struggle against employers. I know many of you here may think that it's a great idea to have harmony between employers and workers, and I think that's the natural kind of static perspective that there will be eventual harmony, but there really isn't at any point unless there's a degree to which there is hegemonic control over the workforce. I would submit to you that in the United States, the degree of hegemonic control over workers is far greater than any place in the world. And by that I mean is that the workers have been, through ideological indoctrination, but mainly through the rapacious nature of employers, the labor force has been ground to a level of submission. Do workers engage in struggles at the workplace? They do anyway, but they do so out of the traditional contours of institutions. Now, on a global level, there has been this is very ironic, because on a global level, the United States has sought to develop trade unions in many parts of the world, and sought to incorporate them into a global structure. Not just the US, but also Western Europe and the rest of the world, including India, have been members of an organization that you all probably are aware of. It's called the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, which is the progenitor of, or the follower of the ICFTU, International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. And these are absolute structures and so forth. In the United States, there has been a tendency over and again, in fact, the United States has the lowest rate of trade union density. By trade union density, just for people who may not know what it is, it means that the share of the labor force as a whole, the working labor force in unions, is very low. Now, we know that this is a dynamic that's taking place throughout the world. It's not just in the United States, but the U.S. as a center of corporate and business strategies, and also liberalization and free markets, has sought to, ironically, restrict trade unions to a very great degree. People would argue that just like markets could have freedom, workers should also have freedom to decide and choose, as if they were choosing between Pepsi and Coca-Cola, which union they should be in, decide whether or not they should be a union. But in fact, most American corporations, including the public sector, have engaged in vast campaigns to prevent unionization. I think it's very clear why employers don't want unionization. I think the most important reason is because they want to maintain control over the workforce. They want to determine what to produce, how to produce it, when to produce, and the conditions of workers. They want to ensure that as much as possible that regulations are not followed. Regulations are usually applied by unions if they are concerned with their workers. They want to ensure that wages are as low as possible. And so if we were to compare, we can't compare the United States with India or other global south countries, but we could compare the United States with other countries of the global north, such as Canada, such as the UK, such as France and continental Europe, and including Japan. The United States falls far behind in the level of wages, average wages, ironically. I mean, many people might think that the United States is the bastion of high-wage capitalism and that the working class there is doing quite well, but actually quite to the contrary, workers in the United States are doing relatively poor on the job. Now, I think we have to examine workers not just on the job, but also within the sphere of exchange and within the process of distribution and how well they fare with respect to capacity to survive and buying commodities and foods and so forth. But I want to start off with the question of the U.S. because the U.S. has a very long tradition of trade union militancy. And this goes to the question of spontaneity. As I've said before, in fact, the United States may have had, and I think it had, does not have, had the most militant workers' movement in the global north. Historically, in the early 20th century through the mid to late 20th century, American working class was extremely militant, mobilized, but not unionized. It's a kind of contradiction. The United States had by far the largest number of strikes up until the 1980s. A lot of people study strikes to designate the degree to which there is a level of militancy, and also strikes affect capital and business profitability. The U.S. actually has had more strike stoppages throughout the 20th century, especially since the 40s to the 1980s, than any northern country. And I think that's important to recognize because it demonstrates the degree to which there is a militant working class. But going back and just very briefly historically, because I don't like to say things in the abstract. I think they're often meaningless if we don't provide examples. And beginning in the early 20th century, one of the most important examples for me and many others is the foundation of the workers' movement. It didn't really start in the late 19th century or the 1860s and 70s because most workers were in craft industries. They were petty craft workers, they were journeymen, and so forth, and they sought to build only almost petty businesses themselves, small businesses, and many of them went on to become entrepreneurs. But there was a trade union movement, and people refer to them as craft unions, skilled workers. By the early 20th century, as we all know from our history, that industrial capital became rooted in mass production, late 19th, early 20th century. The Fordist factory. Everyone here knows what Fordism is, right? Just think of Ford Motors. So how do you build cars? You build them in gigantic factories. And actually the River Rouge factory for many years, which is in Detroit, is one of the largest. Actually, if you go there, it's actually looks like a bombed out building today, because it's fallen to disuse and hardly exists at all. And because of the decline of U.S. manufacturing, it's basically a shell of a building, as is much of Michigan. But the idea of Fordism was the dominant model in the United States. And so there was a tremendous acceleration of production, just as throughout the world you have an acceleration of agricultural production. In the urban context, or industrial complex, there is an acceleration of industrial production. That's happened here as well. So for instance, auto, we all know the industry quite well, that within the auto sector, the capacity to build cars is rooted in a form of Taylorism, time management and so forth. I just saw it a couple of years ago, and actually the last several years at Maruti Suzuki, which at its Monostar plant claims to produce cars, one car every 45 seconds, which is the fastest plant in the world, according to them. I would probably argue that it is. And they do so through extracting as much as possible, not just from the workday, but also from the workers on the job, as some of you, I know, Abhinav Sinha has studied that extensively, and I learned a lot from him, but also from speaking to the workers themselves. Okay, back to the question of U.S. militancy and its syndicalist and spontaneous elements. That in the early 20th century, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which was the progenitor of the AFL-CIO, the Trade Union Center, or as we call it, the Federation of Union, that represents almost all organized workers in the United States. I don't know if that's, oh yeah, can you hear me? Is it muffled? Oh, okay. It comprises one of the largest, it's the largest federation in the United States. Unlike India, we only have really one trade union federation. Yes, we have a few others, but they're really meaningless. I would say one, the AFL. Either you're in it or you're out of it, but that's the one federation. But the AFL in its early foundation, the American Federation of Labor, was in fact a descendant of the craft unions and had a highly conservative ideology. It was rooted in the ideal, at least toward the end, that production industries were competitors with the craft unions. And so they tried to, I mean, in some ways it was conservative, in another way many historians would argue that it wasn't, because there was a degree to which the AFL tried to defend the autonomy of craft workers, tried to defend the positions of craft workers to have autonomy and control over their work lives. Worker control is an extremely important term, not just with respect to mass production industry, but also with respect to small craft industries and workers as well. But the main point I'm trying to make is that, I'm sorry about this echo, is that production, can you hear me? The main point I'm trying to make is that production, to a large extent in the United States and throughout the world, was transformed by the development of mass production. And this occurred with the expansion of automobiles, electronics, machine tools, and what have you, garments and other kinds of production sectors. But mass production became the key. And because the AFL was not disinterested in organizing workers, in fact, a new organizing drive emerged, primarily because of spontaneous worker action. And therefore, I can give you examples. There were mass strikes throughout the period between 1905 to 1920. And they were primarily amongst workers who were outside of the craft industries. There are workers, in many cases, there are agricultural workers involved, because in agriculture we have mass production that took place earlier. And it continues and is accelerated to the point today where we have GMOs and so forth, and that's expanded dramatically. But getting back to the point of spontaneity, the Industrial Workers of the World, which is an organization that formed in 1905, some 111 years ago in July, was wedded to the idea of industrial action. It was a socialist organization. It believed in anti-capitalism. It believed in the creation of a socialism, I would argue an idealist form of socialism, but nonetheless, it refused to negotiate contracts with management. It refused to recognize that management actually owned the industry that they placed into production, which I would argue was in many cases, a revolutionary idea. And we go back, many people today, we forget the legacy of the IWW, which today, numerous people are arguing that this could be the answer for the future. I'm not saying the organization of the IWW, but their tactics, their strategy, and the way they saw things. And so in many cases, the IWW was not just a US organization, it was an international organization with units in the other industrial countries of the global north and in fact the global south. I don't think it was in India. So places like France, the term, for instance, sabotage, or sabotage. Does anyone know the origins of sabotage here? The origins of sabotage comes from a French term word called sabot, which is a cat, which is engaged in extracurricular activity to undermine the employer. I mean, many of the activists within the IWW believed in throwing a wrench into the machinery and to break it down to slow down the production process. And in fact, this helped workers as a whole, because by speeding up and introducing new technology and speeding it up, workers needed the opportunity to slow it down and have more jobs available for a greater number of workers. That's certainly a case that I think Indians could probably relate to. And the IWW was formed by a number of activists and had amongst the most devoted rank and file and political activists in the world at the time. And again, not just in the United States, but in Europe, continental Europe, in the UK, and in South Africa, and a few other countries around the world. They were the dominant, including Mexico, by the way, they were the dominant, so to speak, revolutionary workers organization, although they did not represent a whole lot of workers. Now, one reason why they didn't represent them is because they did not want to represent them in the same way. They did not believe in the same idea of membership where, in the conventional sense. But there are some extremely positive cases that I will give you right now in which the level of worker militancy and also the ability of workers to disrupt not just the mass production industries, because it extended out from mass production into industries such as restaurant and hotel works in cities such as New York. And in the West Coast, there was a tremendous amount of workers in the farm sector, the Western Farm Workers Federation, and also within the mining sector. So it wasn't just rooted within the mass production industry, but expanded beyond. Perhaps the best example, one that is the most famous, that historian Howard Kimmeldorf, as well as Peter Cole, have written about extensively, and is most lauded for, is the organization of the maritime workers in the docks of Philadelphia. Maritime Local 6 of the IWW became one of the most militant workers' unions in the country. Its activity was based exclusively on spontaneity. What they did was, you had the idea of capital as businesses is to reduce levels of solidarity to a bare minimum. So I would make the case that if I were to go, I don't even need to make the case. If you go into a community where there are miners and they're all working in the same pits or extracting gold, diamonds, copper, iron ore, coal, what have you, they will organize. And they will organize spontaneously. That goes without saying. Will they have a union is another point. But they will organize and they will become militant and they will fight the bosses. They will fight multinational capital. I think even the most savvy business person, the most savvy public policy activist should recognize this. This will always happen. You're not going to stop that from happening. Because capital, by its very nature, is oppressive in the way it treats workers. There's no good way of treating workers. Even Google workers in New York, which is considered amongst my students. I'll talk louder if I can. No. Maybe it's because I'll use this. Maybe this is better. No, it's just that, you shouldn't be sorry, I actually like that. Maybe I should use this. Does this work? I think maybe if you were, just carry this. Google workers, for instance, is considered to be one of the best jobs available. But even those workers are highly oppressed workers. They're only working there, they may get paid $100 an hour, which is good even for New York City, or more, but I'd say $100 an hour, and have, basically a workplace that looks like they're at kindergarten. In other words, games to be played and so forth. Where are they located? 6th Avenue and 15th Street in Manhattan. All my students who are undergraduates would love to go, work there, or graduate students as well, because it's just a fun, so-called fun place to work. But they only work there for a couple of weeks or a couple of months at most, and then they may be hired back later on. And ultimately they really can't make ends meet, and they have to commute long distances and so forth. There's only a small proportion. So people consider themselves lucky to be working for this IT company that's considered to be not just at the cutting edge, but at the future, developing, electric cars that drive themselves and so forth, that these programmers are also exploited. I actually would make that case. But going back to the point I'm trying to make with respect to the maritime workers in Philadelphia, which is a port on the East Coast where, oh yeah, that's right, the Democratic Convention is being held this week there, ominously, and not in any way the tradition of the IWW and the maritime workers, comrades. But what they did, men and women, what they did is that what the employer at the docks tried to do is tried to divide the workers as much as possible. Back in the early 20th century, that was done effectively in many industries. The U.S. is a settler colonial state, which means that most of the population today are descendants of people who are occupying land that was once occupied by indigenous people. At least 10 million people were killed during that occupation, indigenous people. But they're also exploited workers, so, and also not all of them are directly responsible for it. And also, we have the legacy of slavery that we have to deal with in the United States that remains very strong as we follow the recent police killings of innocent civilians that continues. By the way, it's not anything new, it's just being filmed. So in other words, we have this extremely racist legacy, the legacy of settler colonialism that Americans easily forget. But, okay, I wanted to make that side point, but the main point is that the kinds of workers that were employed, what the dock companies in Philadelphia tried to do was make sure that people were not of the same ethnic group. So you would have Polish workers, you'd have Italian workers, you'd have Russian workers, you would have German workers, you would have black workers, and on, so that, the idea was that because there were antagonisms on the basis of ethnicity or whatever other kind of identity, but in this case ethnicity, that it's a good way to divide workers. That's why I don't believe that ethnicity should be focused on, or even some forms of identity that many people like to follow within the human rights community. Of course, human rights is crucial and should be resolved on the basis of class solidarity, because people ultimately get hurt on the basis of their inability to eat, their inability to survive, their inability to pay for their children's education or basic health needs. But anyway, so they divided these workers on the basis of ethnicity and race and everything else they could. But the workers recognized that by far the best way to the IWW instilled this notion with a core level of IWW adherents that were doing mass work. And so the workers started, it was illegal to form unions in the dock, so they had little pins that they had that they were IWW Local 6. And that was illegal at the time, to say that you're a member of the union, as it is today, and even in India some places, as well as the United States, so there's no real difference there. So in this case, so what happened is that the workers organized, and within the logistics industries that we call today, within the shipping industry, that is a critical point within the system of distribution of commodities. And so they were receiving ships from throughout the world in Philadelphia, which is a major port, and the workers organized to get higher wages. They were organized spontaneously. They organized with a certain direction of the IWW, but the workers had a democratic aspiration to stop the level of exploitation, to increase wages, not through a collective bargaining agreement like the ICTU seeks to do, but on the spot. If you don't give us the equivalent, let's say today, what's the average wage of an industrial worker here in India? Let's say in the auto sector, anyone know? Well, okay, let me just give you an example. If you don't give me $20 an hour equivalent, we're not going to unload the ship. And we'll let everything rot on the docks. That's really militant unionism. And also it's a level of spontaneity that we rarely see, except for the ship stevedore industries and dock workers, and some other industries that have expanded where workers have higher levels of interactional power versus capital. And we are seeing this increasingly throughout the world in docks. So for instance, when a very good example would be when the Gaza region was bombarded by the Israelis in 2008, and again I believe in, 2012, the dock workers of Oakland and other cities refused to unload in Oakland, refused to unload the ships. And that's a form of spontaneous action in solidarity with the people who were being bombarded by the Israeli military. So in other words, it extends not just from the economic sphere, but also to the sphere of human dignity, which the Palestinians are fighting for. The other point I'd like to make is that, to take it to a more contemporary level, that the IWW still exists today, but it's a shell of itself, and I don't know how much, how effective they are. I would argue that their tactics are effective, but organizationally they really don't exist. In the early 2020s, many of the IWW members became members of the non-revisionist Communist Party in the United States, which was very effective in its early years as well. Organizing machine tools, organizing in auto and a number of other sectors that led the basis for industrial action in the United States in the 1930s, which were the most militant of any period in its history. And by the way, workers were one of the most forms of strikes that were done spontaneous have been against unions. In other words, unions have frequently, and I would argue almost all the time, especially capitalist unions, which they all are, for the most part, they seek to sign collective bargaining agreements to restrict the power of workers by having a collective bargaining agreement which lasts anywhere, let's say, from 3 years, it could be less, 3 years to 5, and outrageously even 7 years. Can you imagine a collective bargaining agreement of 7 years? But the IWW said, no, we're signing a collective bargaining agreement for 1 day. When we need more money, we'll go back to you. And these are workers who needed money. In other words, if we find that we're exploited, we're going to go back and fight again. And they had complete worker support. And by the way, I should make this case, they collected dues as well, and workers happily paid them. They didn't collect them through a union checkoff system, which we have in the United States, and it exists here as well, which means that the employer or the state takes a portion of the worker's salary and gives it to the union bureaucracy. They got dues directly from the workers, which means that some people would argue that it leads to a level of weakness. I would argue it leads to a higher level of class identity and responsibility that we need not only in the unions but also in political organizations. I'd like to turn to an example. I could talk about political economy, but in this case I'd like to turn to the example of the South African mine workers that waged, I would argue, a series of strikes from the period of 2009 to the present, of wildcat strikes, one after another. And again, here is a case where workers are fighting both against management, both against the union, the dominant union. That's a state-dominated, corporate-dominated yellow union, in my view. I think just about anybody who wants to look at it rationally. Most people think that. So here's an example where they're fighting against the state, the union, and multinational capital. And as we all know, that in South Africa, mining is the richest. In Southern Africa has the richest, for some reason. South Africa is where the richest deposits of mines are in the world, in what is known as the Marinsky Belt. And they had diamonds, gold, and many others. They still have a lot of gold there and diamonds, but they've declined to a large degree. And the most important mineral that they export is for automobile production primarily, and that's platinum, which is the most expensive mineral, as I told others the other day, the most valuable and precious mineral in the world, which goes for, at one time, up to $1,400 an ounce. But I'm not going to get into that at the moment. I'm going to say that you had tens of thousands of workers from the period 2009 to the present who have been actively engaged in insurrectionary activity. Spontaneity to a large extent. Spontaneous workers' movements in which, well, how does it play itself out? Workers in the mines live in the same communities. Workers in the mines may live in the same dormitories that are constructed explicitly by the state and its state NGOs to so-called support workers who are actually migrant workers who may have almost always have to go back to their homes in the Eastern Cape or Mozambique or Swaziland or wherever it may be of South Africa. They go back, so in other words, they need support services. Many of them go there alone without their families and so forth. Yet these workers still organized, and they organized in a very militant fashion. And over the period, I would even say, since 2006, this organization expanded of workers against the post-apartheid state that was put into force by Nelson Mandela. Whatever positive things we can say about Nelson Mandela, he did sell out. He did sell out. And I say that in all due respect to him. He agreed to, I think this is a major achievement, agreed to establish a system of democracy in South Africa for everyone. But he did not seek it in any way to ameliorate or even address the question of distribution. And so today, in South Africa, you have the widest differentiation in the Gini coefficient anywhere in the world. In other words, the distribution of wealth between the working class and the wealthy is at the highest level, much more than India. One point I would say is that many people anecdotally say, I haven't done the research, but you may want to check it, that the two members of the Oppenheimer family, who are mining magnates, own 50% of the wealth of South Africa. You'd have to check it, but a lot of people have told me that in South Africa. So, with respect to spontaneity, you've had the outburst of workers' insurrections, and the insurrections took place against the state which controlled the unions, because you had a system of corporatism where unions, the state, and management negotiated and bargained together. Well, what's missing with that? Where are the workers? Where are the workers at the table? There weren't any workers at the table whatsoever. These were people who considered themselves to be socialists, which were not far from it, who argued that they had the best interests of the workers of the state, and they bargained away the rights of workers in many instances. Their wages declined dramatically as a result of the increasing use of migrant labor, but also because of the use of new technology that eliminated a number of tasks, especially in the refining and smelting factories in the mining sector. I consider mining factory work, especially if you're working underground, but also smelting is one of the major procedures that's used in mining. And actually, I wish I could show you pictures. I have a file of many pictures from South Africa, but this took place over a period of from 2009 to 2014. So at first, I remember that some of the mills mining pits that were taken over by workers, they were seized by workers, and all production stopped. And they were done so what is referred to as illegal strikes. All the strikes were illegal, especially if you occupy the facility. And in South Africa, it was allowed, actually the state judiciary as well as the state police had threatened to go after the workers and so forth on a regular basis, but the workers formed their own assembly. Now I can give you a schematic of what goes on, but I don't think we have time here. But just for the moment, there was a leading mine workers union that was very closely tied to the state. It still exists, the National Union of Mine Workers, that was actually one of the main spearheads of the anti-apartheid movement, believe it or not, that actually became a lackey of capitalists there. And then the workers rejected it on their own, without a union. They said, we reject this union. Either the union has to get its act together, it either has to represent us, or we're going to take action on our own. That's exactly what they did. And what they did was they held workers' assemblies. Anyone here know what a worker assembly is? Essentially, they would take over, not just the mines, they would take over, they would have stadiums and various arenas where they would sit for days and discuss what their needs were in a highly democratic way, democratic and socialist, and if I may, communist way, the way that they were working together. The South African workers do adhere to the principles of Marxism-Leninism, by the way. I know that many people here may not want to hear that, but if you go to South Africa, you ask what their people's ideology is, it's Marxist-Leninist. There are developments of organizations, and this is where we come into the question of a party. There really isn't a party to represent this sentiment of workers. But there was an organization that formed, and it's really interesting how this formed. If you want to read my book, I would suggest it, because it deals with the question of the organization of workers and the ways in which workers really didn't care who represented them, because they pushed the organization to farther heights. There's a problem with that, but I think by and large it demonstrates a syndicalist activity, a spontaneity, a degree to which they are absolutely clear about their rights. And therefore I go full circle to the point I made. Workers will always organize, no matter how oppressed they are. Even at Google, in fact, the work of James Scott talks about it, the famous sociologist from Yale, I think he's retired now, talks about the ideas in which workers resist. And in many cases, they resist through gossip, telling jokes about the employer and so forth, talking behind their backs. I mean, as an organizer myself, we could refer to that as agitation. But workers do that on their own anyway, so you just guide it if you really want to create a campaign that's effective. This goes out of the mentality, I don't think most NGOs understand this whatsoever. There's a complete lack of understanding of workers' interests, how they organize, what workers want, and the real severe levels of oppression that workers face every single day on the job, especially with respect to industrial workers, mining workers, and workers who live in this part of the world, or most of the world. I shouldn't even say this part of the world. 90% of the planet is Global South workers. What happened in South Africa in the days leading up to August 2018, 2012, or 18 August 2012, were outrageous, where there was a war between the state, along with the union that supported the state, the National Union of Mine Workers, the state represented by the judiciary apparatus and by the apparatus of violence, that would be the state police, that are supposed to protect people's rights, that actually engaged in a massacre of 34, but I would argue even, they killed 34 people, injured well over 100, close to 200 workers, but many more workers died over the course of a period of several years, I would say hundreds of workers. And these are, workers who don't have names. And that's why I would also recommend reading a book that's coming out by Luke Sinwell called The Spirit of Americana, which doesn't talk about unions necessarily, it talks about the mobilization of workers themselves. I go next to the point that, well, what becomes of these organizations? Is it a one-off that people say, okay, we're done with this, then we'll move on to the next struggle? I fear that that might be the case, because the workers, as we say in political science and sociology, as we're organizers, they're in motion. They are ready for a revolutionary situation here. What do I mean by revolution? They're ready to transform their society away from this highly oppressive post-apartheid regime that has essentially acceded to a colonial, neo-colonial state that is still dominated by the white authorities, the white ruling class. Not all the ruling class is white, but it's primarily made up of white people and also a thin layer of black South Africans who are serving as their, basically their government. Now, things could change in very dramatic ways, but there have been efforts to build new organizations and so forth, yet they haven't occurred at the point, and I think they need to be, it reflects the point that where will this struggle go? If you do not have an organization, you just have this incredible spirit of workers, as Luke Sinwell does, shows in some real great, fascinating ethnographic detail. And again, I strongly recommend reading it, however you can get it. Maybe we can get it sold cheaply in this country. It just came out. And he gives credit to these workers. By the way, the workers were surrounded by helicopters. They were shot at point-blank range. They created fences in which, this is not heroic, this is outrageous. The workers did not seek to be killed by staying on the mountain. And there was really no organization to say, okay, enough already, we need to stop this. In fact, AMCU, one of the most decent unions in my view that rarely gets any kind of attention whatsoever, an association, mine workers and construction union, which is an economistic union that seeks economic demands, because there really isn't any political organization that can mobilize the demands of the working class there. There is because of the dominance of the state and also some of the other distractions of other parties. And so I submit to you, because I'm giving you a presentation based on exclusively the charge that I had here, I would submit that there is, and I'll turn it over to, I'd like to call you Professor, but I call you, because I have great admiration for Mr. Sinha. I'd like to say that there is an absolute need, and I have worked as a union organizer for many years. I've studied unions for my entire lifetime, even as a kid, to tell you the truth. And I've I've looked at all the options and have been open to hearing others. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but I believe very strongly that the only way to transform not just South Africa, but India and the United States is to have a party, or to have an organization of some kind that's capable of channeling demands in a way that is directed at transforming society. We are not living in a just world. Capitalism doesn't work except it works for the ruling class very well, but it doesn't work for the vast majority of people. And again, you know, I'm saying this because I actually did go to institutions like this as a younger person and was recruited by a number of NGOs which I did not go to, I'll be honest with, because I felt, I won't get into that, you can ask me later. But I felt that there really was something that was necessary beyond the kind of two-party or democratic bourgeois system that we have today. And I'm not saying this is a form of polemics, which I know is part of the series. I'm just saying that in an honest and direct way based on my experience as a trade unionist. I remain a trade unionist, by the way. I am a member of a trade union today, a very largest teachers union in the United States. And it's a good one, but it's not enough. It's not enough to resolve problems even in our own union, because we have part-timers who can't get jobs, who are working at wages that are impossible to survive on. We have in the same shops of our universities, like this would be considered a nice facility in New York, believe it or not. Well, of course it's the Tata Institute for Social Sciences, it should be. But you know, we have working class students and, for the most part, and immigrant students, majority by far. These students are highly, you know, they're very smart and so forth, but they're very low. Their parents and their families are poor. And many of the workers who are employed in support staff get paid below, forget about the living wage, barely the minimum wage. And these are union negotiated contracts. I can't overestimate. The union negotiates contracts that are at the minimum wage. Good, right? What kind of world is that? What kind of model does the United States supply for the rest of the world when they negotiate contracts that are minimum wage and they don't even enforce those contracts? I'm not saying my union enforces a contract. So I consider myself part of the labor aristocracy. But that term is also loaded as well, because we can I have a different perspective on labor aristocracy as a whole. I consider most United States denizens as part of the labor aristocracy, even though they're not members of unions. But that's not part of the remit here. I just want to make the point that, you know, I've studied a number of countries in the global south, from Latin America to China, India, which is going to be the largest country in the next few years, population-wise, and it's probably the center of the future of the planet in many ways. It's a place that, as I was speaking to a friend earlier today, you can't go to India and say you've been there because there's so many Indias, and it's a wonderful country. And yet, I would also argue very strenuously there's a need for a principled organization, not a communist party that's social democratic, not an NGO that it calls themselves socialist, which I'm not going to name names here, but we all know who we're talking about, at least one or two of them, that takes money from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation or the Friedrich Ebert Foundation or American Ford Foundation or Rockefeller Foundation. It's not going to work, and that's not the only reason why it doesn't work, but you can't buy worker solidarity by bribing them with money or saying that or paying staffers high levels. That's the American model. And I think that Indian academics, intellectuals, people who care about the world, as well as especially here, I think I actually love this country as much as any other. You notice I didn't say United States. I think it's a wonderful place. I love being here. I particularly love the monsoon season. But I say this actually in real terms, that I think the Indian leaders such as you, future leaders such as yourselves, and you have great professors here, I have great admiration for Bindu and so forth, that you will be the leading edge for the future. And so I very much strongly would like to learn from you as much as possible about your ideas, and to talk about a revolutionary party, I can go on, but I don't want to take up too much time, and want to turn it over, if I may, to Abhinav Sinha, who is a leading intellectual in my view. Perhaps he's an organic intellectual, but he's one of the, in my view, the most knowledgeable activists, if not the most. Well, he's amongst the most. I don't like superlatives. Sorry, I don't like that. So he's amongst the most knowledgeable activists in this country. So I think we're really honored to have Abhinav, and I am honored to have to know him. So anyway, Abhinav, I think the floor is yours, right? Is that right? I think this is the best way to handle it. But.